Welcome to Tech Talk Tuesday, brought to you by Idaho Public Television and Montana PBS.
Hi, welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. This month in December, we are talking about coding and how to get going with coding in your classroom. Last week, we gave you just a quick overview of coding and why it's something to try with your students if you haven't tried it before, or to pick back up again if you haven't done it yet this school year. This week, we're going to talk about unplugged coding experiences. And this is for classrooms that maybe don't have access to as much technology, or maybe you're sharing devices or you really don't have any on hand, or you just want to find some other hands-on ways to get students coding that doesn't involve having a device. And fortunately, there are a ton of resources available that are free, that are available for teachers to help students get started with coding. And I'll say when I started with coding, I did start with unplugged activities with my kids before I ever put an iPad in their hands to code, because I really wanted them to understand that what coding was. It would be very easy to pick up a tablet and start playing a game and not really connect the fact that they were playing a game and coding was part of the game. So I wanted to make sure I was really deliberate about teaching them about coding, what it was and how it worked. And I did that by using unplugged activities. So we're going to share some of our favorites. Carrie, what are your favorite unplugged coding activities and where do you find them?
Well, there's a lot of them, and I think it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be specific coding unplugged, right? Anything that requires kids to think about a sequence of things happening in an exact order, or computational thinking type of activities. So when you're searching for games or looking for activities to do, you can think a little bit outside the box of coding. And really, if I were starting with younger kids, especially, I would start with sequencing and thinking about how do we sequence things. And actually, I taught fifth graders, and I often introduced our coding units using the peanut butter and jelly sandwich activity, which you could do this with just about anything, but basically I would tell the kids I would give them very little instruction, and I would just say, please write down all the steps to making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Now, inevitably, because they're kids, typically what I would get is get 2 pieces of bread, put peanut butter on one and jelly on the other, put them together and eat it. But there's about 1 million steps in there that they missed, right? Like opening the bread package, unscrewing the lid from the peanut butter. So I would just have them write it down. And then I would either, depending on how much time we had and how many resources I had, sometimes I would bring in bread and peanut butter and jelly. I would have them trade papers with each other, and I would say, now you are a robot. You can only do exactly what is on this paper. You cannot do anything else. And inevitably the kids would be so frustrated, right? Because it didn't say to open the peanut butter jar, so they couldn't open it. And it didn't say to use a knife to spread it. And they would be like, but this doesn't say what I need. And then I would have them trade papers back, and I would have the kids rewrite the steps and include every single step and then do it again. If I didn't have the time or the resources to provide bread and peanut butter for every kid, then I would just have them do it. And for littles, like kindergartners, you could just ask them to tell you the steps and you follow them exactly. Because you still get a similar thing where the kindergartners will say, get bread, but they don't tell you to open the bread, right? Get peanut butter, they don't tell you to open the jar. So really being deliberate, and it sounds kind of funny and it does get them frustrated, but it really starts making them think about, I'm a robot, I'm pretending to be a robot. I can only do exactly what you say. In a computer, when you are coding it, only does exactly what you tell it. So you cannot skip steps. You have to think about every single thing. So you can do a similar thing. I know of an occupational therapist that has used coding to help kids tie shoes. Because that is a sequential thing as well. So it doesn't have to be coding. Really getting them thinking about that sequential sort of first this, then that kind of thinking is a great way to start. And then we've referenced this before, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as in the coming weeks, but PBS Kids has an app called PBS Kids Scratch Junior that has some really great resources as well. And I'm pulling them up here, and I'm going to share my screen and show you, because there's some cool unplugged activities. So this is actually on PBS Learning Media. And if you go to, you can find the PBS Kids Scratch Junior collection, and there's supplemental resources. And you'll see here, this is another one of my favorites, which is the human robot activity. So this is a handout of what the blocks in Scratch Junior look like. So this is a handout you print off, the kids cut out the blocks, and then they code each other. And so we've done this where you have one kid be the programmer, they sort of lay out the blocks in an order, and then another kid has to come in, and again they have to be the robot and only do exactly what the blocks say. And again, it's just a really great way to start getting kids to, first of all, they're active because they're up and moving, but it also again starts making them think about every single step along the way. So I love that. There's also an activity that's one of my favorites that I find kids love, and like Nikki said, sometimes I've just done this with kids, and this is all we've done. And we play a version of Simon Says. It's Scratch Junior Simon Says. And I took these cards and printed them off, and it's hard to see with my background, and laminated them. Partly because if you just use the slide deck, they're all in order, and the kids figure out pretty quickly that the first one is a green flag, second one isn't, next one's green flag, right? So I laminated them, and I can just hold it up. The idea is that the green flag is like Simon Says. And if you hold up a card with the green flag, the kids have to do the action. So, this one is moving back. So the kids have to take a step back. If it doesn't have a green flag, it's just like if someone does not say Simon Says and the kids don't move at all. And I love this game again, and then it gets harder. It gets to be where there's a couple of them that then start having two actions. And so now the kids have to do both. I love this for Unplugged, but I also love it as introduction. And I use this as an introductory way to introduce kids to the blocks before, like Nikki said, before we even touch iPads or get on the computer. We play Simon Says multiple times. And it gets them familiar with what each block does. And then they jump in and they see those same blocks and they're like, oh, I already know what this does. And so it's a really great way to do that. The final sort of one of my favorite activities that I did at a summer camp with kids is called a Q-tip maze. So we used these human robot cards, and I gave the kids a whole bunch of Q-tips, which are fairly cheap. So it was an inexpensive activity, and we were spread out all over the gym, and they designed mazes with Q-tips. And then their goal was then I brought little animals, from my kid. He has a million like dinosaurs or whatever. So I brought the dinosaurs, and the kids had to code animals through the maze, and they got to rotate and do each other's mazes and try to solve it and work together. And those kids were actively engaged in Q-tip mazing for like 4 hours because they designed their own mazes and then they went through each other's. And so even something as simple as that, where they got down on the floor, they were working together, they were designing a maze, and then they used the blocks to code their animal through the maze. So those are some of my favorite. Now, like I said, and I think Nikki said, there's a bunch of resources for Unplugged, but those are some of just sort of my favorite really quick activities to share. And I know Nikki's going to share some as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and throw it back over to Nikki to share some of her favorite Unplugged games or resources.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So I think one of the first things that I think it's an obvious thing maybe, but I won't assume that this is what everybody's practice is, but if you're looking for unplugged activities, our friend Google is a great place to go. Is to just unplugged coding activities, put that into your Google search and see what comes up. And the first thing that comes up is this one from code.org, which is actually the easiest way to find these activities on code.org. And if you're not familiar, code.org is a free website that has a full curriculum, K through 12, that teachers can use to teach coding in their classroom. And this page details some of the unplugged coding activities that are part of their curriculum. And they are embedded into the curriculum. So if you're taking it a lesson at a time, following code.org, you can. Or if you're looking for just one lesson in particular that you want to do with students, I like these happy maps and happy loops activities because I believe they are printables. It gives you all of your lesson and your activities of what you need to do, but it's just, again, using arrows to help kids find their way around a grid. So this is probably a lesson you might have in your social studies curriculum for your map reading skills, or it could be something in your math curriculum when you're looking at directionality. And it's not hard to, give this guy directions to get to here. And so what arrows would he need to follow in order to get from point A to point B? So that is one way to explore coding. I'll move my toolbar up here. But if we go back to our Google Unplugged coding activities, this one comes up, and Codable is actually the first website I ever used for coding, and it's very user friendly and really engaging for kiddos who are getting going with coding. So you see they have some unplugged worksheets as well as some unplugged activities that teach some of the basic goals of coding using bits of paper that you have around the house. You can also use little body movements, playing follow the leader. It's a really good example, just like Carrie's Simon Says activity. And then talking about these if-then conditional statements. So I think once you start digging into these unplugged activities, you'll go, oh, I already do some of this. I'm doing this in math, or I'm doing this in language arts. I think this fits. I just didn't know it was coding before. So that's one way to find coding things. The other thing is bust out some of those old school board games that you might have in your house, or that I think Target has like the retro aisle now, where you can go and find the board games that also teach things in a sequence. So my family and I went to a Forest Service cabin this summer, and at the cabin they had a bunch of board games, and one of them was Battleship. And if you remember, Battleship is a game where you had your little plastic table thing and these little plastic pegs, and you have to set up your ships, and you can't see what the other person is doing. And you're using the coordinate plane and the grid to try and sink each other's ships. My family played Battleship all weekend. It was unplugged, low tech. Those games are easy to find either online or at Amazon. Partners can play, and it's teaching kids to think critically first about where they're going to place their ships and what coordinates they're going to call out, keeping track of the hits and the misses, and then really trying to guess and overcome their opponents. So that's a really fun one that uses the skills of coding. The other one I played with my class, we called it Guess My Pattern. And we did this with the pattern blocks that lived in our classroom, the hexagon and triangles and all of that. And we used a file folder or like a binder like this. And the kids set up their binder between one another so they couldn't see each other's workspace. So if Carrie and I were playing, my binder is guarding my little space. And then I took a handful of pattern blocks and I had them start with just like 3 or 4. And they had to place them in some kind of a design. So it might be a hexagon in the middle, triangle on top, square below it, and triangles on the side. So, and then their partner had to try and guess how that pattern was arranged. And so we did it a couple ways. The person who made the pattern would call out directions. Start with a yellow hexagon, put it in the middle. Okay, now get a green triangle and place it on top of the hexagon. So they have to think through each direction that tries to get their partner to recreate their design. That's one way of doing it. The other ways they could do it is they got it more challenging by just saying you need 1 hexagon, 3 triangles, and 4 squares. Now guess my pattern. And so the kids would come up with it, and then they'd look and go, you need to change your triangles and put them in a different place. And so kind of a trial by error. But these were great partner activities that involve some critical thinking and some having some strategy about what you were doing, but didn't require any technology. And so in my class, maybe even if I had kids coding on the iPads, I might have kids coding over here doing an unplugged activity. So those were my favorite unplugged ones. Carrie, did you want to add anything?
No, just what I also love about what you shared is with Battleship, with the pattern, guess my pattern, whatever, I can't remember what you called it, is that in addition to the coding skills, think of the language skills that are also being developed as kids have to express and describe where their pattern is. I always think of that because I have a child who has some language delays. And so just thinking of, oh my gosh, I was thinking as you were saying that, like I should play that with my kid because it's a really good way. And that's what I love about coding is that it is so many skills in one, but kids typically don't. They love it and they don't realize that they're learning all of these skills. You know, we're tricking them into learning some of these cool skills. But I was just thinking about that as you were describing that game again, about the language that is required to play that game and how good that is for kids who, you know, need to speak and have the practice with language. Mm-hmm. The other, I will just share really quickly, one thing that I loved as well, especially when talking about littles. I did a training with some teachers who are a group of kindergarten teachers, and they decided that they would spend the whole first semester using the blocks from the Simon Says as their directions for their students throughout the year. So they would focus on one. And so when they wanted their kids to walk down the hall, they would hold up the sign in the direction the kids were supposed to walk. There's one where the kids grow and shrink. And so when the kids needed a movement break, they would do that with them. There's a jump one. And so they spent the whole first semester using no tech the entire time and just used the blocks with no flag. So they used, of course, every single one I'm pulling up right now. Okay, there we go. So they just used the blocks with no flags as directional movements and things for their kids. And then in January after Christmas break, they decided it was time, and they got the iPads out, and their kids had almost zero learning curve because they already knew what all of the blocks did. And they already had that relationship with what the green flag meant, which meant go. They had the relationship with what the blocks meant. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's genius, especially for those kinders who maybe aren't quite ready to start coding on a tablet in September, but by January they might be. And so that was not my idea. That was these teachers who got together after my training and decided that's how they were going to do it. And then told me they were doing that. And then they shared it with me later. And I was like, oh, mind blown. Like, anyway, I think that there's a million ways to sort of ease into that. There's one block that means wait. And so if the teacher was at her desk and the kid needed something, she'd hold up the wait block. Like all of those things, I just think are such fun ways for us, for you, for teachers to integrate it without having to use any kind of a device. So anyway, I just thought of that as you were talking and thought I would share that example as well, because I thought it was a great one.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, hopefully you got some good ideas for how to get started with coding using some of the unplugged activities. We'll be back next time to talk about some plugged activities and some of the cool apps and websites that you can get kids started coding any grade level, any content area. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.